The U.S. bishops met recently to discuss sex abuse by bishops, but were blocked by the Vatican from taking steps to address it. In an exclusive, the former head of the Vatican Doctrinal Office, Cardinal Gerhard Müller, gives us his perspective on the abuse crisis. And finally, mother of poet, philosopher, and peace advocate Mattie Stepanek, Dr. JENI STEPANEK, talks about carrying her son's message for peace forward and Mattie's cause for sainthood the world over. Thanksgiving edition begins right now.
Now, from Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over, and a very warm and happy Thanksgiving to all of you. The Church Universal continues to grapple with this sex abuse scandal, the Vigano testimony, and Pope Francis's continued silence on the matter. Meanwhile, the Vatican blocked the U.S. bishops from voting on any substantive action last week at their fall meeting. Recently, I sat down with the former head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, once the second most powerful man in the Vatican, until he was dismissed by Pope Francis in 2017. He has a perspective unlike any other on these current scandals in the Church, and he had much to tell me. Here is my most recent interview with Cardinal Gerhard Müller. I want to start with these questions of sex abuse swirling all over the world. You were in charge. Following Cardinal Ratzinger, you were the man charged with investigating these cases from an ecclesial point of view. When an allegation of sexual abuse arrived at your office at the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, how would it proceed? What was the procedure that you undertook?
It needs all the proofs of the accusations. At the end, we make a sentence with punishments, and in some cases, the occasions are not true, but in the most cases, the accusations are true. But I think the sexual abuse in the clergy is not coming out of the celibacy, nothing to do with it, but it's a question of the whole society, the breakdown of the moral principles in the public, and therefore this entered also in the Church, but the Church never changed their teaching that every attack against the sixth commandments is a mortal sin.
Give me a sense, Your Eminence, because few people in the world have had the vantage point of looking at the entire globe, and particularly how this question is affecting the Church today. As you looked at the cases you considered and investigated, the preponderance of them were what? Were they predominantly children, women, men? Who were the victims in most of these cases that you investigated?
No, we can say 80% or more. The victims had been young people, but not girls, boys. We'll say 14, beginning at 14 years. It's more than a homosexual attack as a pedophile attack. This was not the victims are not the great big majority are not children.
Right, they're teenagers and older.
Teenagers and older.
Did you see, as we're seeing today, it seems everyone's grappling with the abuse of seminarians. Was that something you saw as a regular occurrence in these accusations?
No, it does not belong to this to the mission and the task of this congregation. Is only the abuse until 18 years. And here we have a lack in the legislation. In the older times, former times, also the congregation was responsible for all abuses in sexual region, in sexual elements. And they were reduced only this sexual abuse until 18 years. But an abuse of a seminarian, of a young man, is also a mortal sin and is not acceptable. And the Church, I think, we must do anything also against these homosexual attacks.
Your Eminence, we keep hearing, in fact, the Pope in opening the synod, during the opening ceremony of the synod, he said clericalism must be rooted out. It is the source of so many evils. And certainly from clerics all over the United States, we keep hearing clericalism is the reason for the sex abuse crisis. In your estimation, is that true?
No, because 99% of sexual abuse are made by people who has nothing to do with priesthood and clergy in the society. And therefore the clericalism, and the question is, what is clericalism? The definition of clericalism. We have a good understanding, a Bible-based understanding of what is priesthood and the succession of the apostolate, of the apostles, and that cannot be the reason. The reason of sexual abuse is only the non-respect of the sixth commandment of God. That is sexual abuse.
Your Eminence, there were a number of reports in recent days that we've read that, going back to 2017, the last time we talked together, that you were relieved of your duties at the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, as were 3 priests who worked for you, because in the eyes of some near the Pope and maybe the Pope himself, you were viewed as being not merciful enough to sexual abusers. 20% of the cases you reviewed, those men were laicized. Is there any truth in those reports?
The Pope never gave some reasons for this dismissing of my collaborators and of myself. But I can say these people and I myself was always on the line of the precedes and the procedure, and we had been very strong and very clear, and we cannot make false compromises if anybody in this clergy has bravely abused a child or young man or the woman. He cannot return to the altar, must be secularized or laicized, and this politics we had was not all the time seen very well by some cardinals or bishops in the Roman Curia. But I can say also in this context in America that Cardinal Mueller was all the times on my side for a strong vision, for a strong and very justful reaction against sexual abuse. But there are other cardinals who, as their name are very openly known. He made the soft line. We had been the hard line.
A harder line, yeah. And the story I keep hearing, and I've heard it in Rome, I've heard it here in the United States, that you were following the procedures, you would have the canonical trials, and you would met out the just punishments as the evidence demanded. Yet there were many near the Holy Father and in the Curia who were unhappy with that position.
Yeah, some people have a misunderstanding of mercy. The first mercy we must have is for the victims and not for the perpetrators. And is my understanding, if a priest has done not anything wrong, but a grave sin, a great crime, he cannot return to the altar because he is not a functionary of the church. He is a representative of Jesus Christ, the good shepherd. And the good shepherd is doing all the good for the sheep and cannot ruin young people or elderly people.
You read, no doubt, Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano's testimony, and now the second testimony that has shaken so many areas of the church. Were you surprised at the allegations he made there?
I was not so surprised, but I want to propose also to the Holy Father to speak with him, to look for reconciliation with him, and to give answers to these accusations or questions for the people of God, because the people of God has a right to know what happened. It's always is possible that are made some mistakes or mishandling of certain cases, but we must learn of our mistakes, out of our mistakes, and we must become better in the persecution of child and minor abuse. Yeah. And not to split the church in different groups. The Holy Father has this office of the unity of the church in the faith and in the communion. He must be the symbol of the unity of the church. We must overcome, with the help of the Holy Father, the splitting of the church in conservatives or so-called liberals. We are one church united in the faith and not in a conservative or liberal ideology.
Let's talk for a moment about the heart of Archbishop Vigano's contention, which is that sanctions were placed upon Cardinal McCarrick by then Pope Benedict. Now, you served from 2012 to 2017 under both Pope Benedict and Pope Francis. Were you aware ever of sanctions, privately or otherwise, laid upon Cardinal Theodore McCarrick?
As a congregation, I didn't know nothing about these measures against him. And privately I heard a little bit, this person is too liberal. I heard it, but what does it mean, liberal or not? But if this all is true, of what he is accused, there must be made a canonical process against him. And
why do you think that hasn't happened yet? There is no canonical trial scheduled, or none that we know of.
But it's necessary to do it, and I think the congregation and the doctrine of the faith must be charged with this task to make a correct canonical process, but have all the informations, and all the people of God has a right to know what is true or not true.
I want to read you something.
We cannot handle these things always hidden in the background. This is a public challenge
and a
scandal, and therefore we must overcome with all these means we have in the church with a canonical process.
I want to read you something. This is from the second Vigano letter that just dropped last week. In it, he says, the Pope's cover-up of McCarrick was clearly not an isolated mistake. Many more instances have recently been documented in the press showing that Pope Francis has defended homosexual clergy who committed serious sexual abuses against minors or adults. These include his role in the case of Father Julio Grassi in Buenos Aires, his reinstatement of Father Mauro Inzoli after Pope Benedict had removed him from ministry until he went to prison, at which point Pope Francis laicized him, and his halting of the investigation of sex abuse allegations against Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor. Now, Your Eminence, there is a story, First Things magazine reported, that back in 2013, you are saying Mass at the Santa Monica Chapel, and your assistant comes in and says, the Pope is on the phone for you. And it was concerning the Cormac Murphy O'Connor investigation. Is that story true?
I cannot go in details because I am bound on the pontifical secret, but I can tell only that we in the congregation had always correct and hard line, but for the investigation against a bishop or cardinal, the congregation need a special allowance of the Pope. No? That is the problem, and I think we should change this point, that first the congregation must begin with the investigation, and there is not needed an interference of the Pope, or there came some friends to the Pope and that this man is innocent, it's this bad congregation, these dogmatics and these hardliners in the congregation, or Müller is in German, is too strong, and so, and all these things and all these meanings must be kept out. It must be an ordinary process, and only at the end the Holy Father must be informed, and he has the last decision. But they cannot be obstacled. A real process, also in the states, the public right is not possible. So the president of the United States make a call to the tribunal and they stop.
Yeah.
It's not possible.
Right. He can't call the Supreme Court and stop a case.
And we need the independence of the ecclesiastical courts and the canonical process.
So if I'm reading between the lines, it seems, and I've read a lot of reportage on this, that the Holy Father himself and those near him blocked the investigation of Cormac Murphy O'Connor, and you were opposed to Father Inzoli being restored to the priesthood as well. Is that true?
There's a great problem in this pontificate are the so-called friends of the popes who are in reality more his enemies. And we, it's true, friends are called on some mass media the enemies of the Pope, but this is thinking the categories of friendships or not friendships is not helpful. We need a correct handling of the questions of faith and discipline and moral, and not this system of personal relationships and all the time when the group of the 9 cardinals is coming together, anything is happening because some of them are asking personally to the Holy Father, I want as president of the conference, Episcopal, as this candidate for a bishop only for the play of power and not because this person is the most qualified to be the shepherd of this and to bypass the congregation of the bishops. That is the problem.
I have to tell you, Your Eminence, I am stunned after I've been covering the Vatican for 25 years. It's the first time I guess I've thought that a congregation head, even the head of the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, doesn't have the authority to investigate a bishop or a cardinal. I assumed you had that authority, but apparently you don't.
Only investigate for priests. No? But for bishops and the cardinals, we need a special permission of the Pope. No?
And if he denies that permission, you can go no further with an investigation.
We cannot go further, no. Not possible. No?
Wow. You have spoken about this interference in the past.
But it's belonging to a certain understanding of canonical law, but my proposal is to make the congregation in these cases more independent. No? And they must inform at the end of the result of the investigation the Pope. But it's not good that the Pope takes over this right to stop a necessary investigation.
You've spoken about this in some interviews, about this interference and how when outside forces, whether they be close to the pontiff or not, when they intrude on an investigation, you're undercutting the mercy to the victim. You're undercutting the justice to the victim. Yeah, is there any concept that that's what's happening here?
You know, the victims has a right to know what is about the decisions the congregation made. Normally they are not informed, no? And we should renew all these paragraphs. These paragraphs of the procedure are not of divine right. This is a normal human being must learn also from the civil legislation and the courts, and to have more independence in the investigation and the sentences.
I want to read you something. The Holy Father, on an in-flight press conference most recently on September 25th, he said, and he was coming back from Estonia, he said, I have received so many sentences of condemnation from the doctrine of faith, and I said, let's move forward, let's move forward. Never after a guilty verdict did I sign a request for a pardon. This is non-negotiable. Is that what you saw when you were at that
I had
congregation?
all the time a relatively good relation personally to the Holy Father. He encouraged me. But then they instituted a special college separated from the congregation.
The College of Cardinals, that was 9 cardinals.
No, not in the other case. In the congregation, within the congregation, 10 persons who made all the recourses, and they had been decided against our opinion in many cases to reduce the penalty. Because some of them have this opinion, we cannot laicize a priest. They are absolutely against the secularization of a priest. They have anything wrong, he must receive a penalty, but not the dismissal of the clerical state. And this was always a controversy behind it. And we see now the result of this absolute false politics, so naive, not understanding that didn't have learned anything of our experience. And I can only repeat my meaning: if the abuse is so great and so big, is the only solution and the only justice for the victim is that this perpetrator must be dismissed of the clerical state. If you are, as priest, a good shepherd, you cannot ruin the sheep.
I wish others agreed with you, Your Eminence. I think a lot of the lay people certainly do, and the world looking in
must.
must.
This is the only escape of this crisis. And we are in this crisis because we had not, some bishops were not bad thinking, but they are so naive. They do not enough, they knew not enough about these terrible consequences the victims have.
So what you're really saying is this misplaced idea of mercy, sparing these priests or bishops the penalties they deserve, really is the cause of this abuse crisis.
Yes, it's going back to the 16th, 17th. There was a meaning, Jesus preached the love, I don't need laws in the church. But it is stupid because we are a communion of men, and therefore love is coming from God. But we can become sinners, or we can do crimes, and therefore the church needs these rights of penalties against the members, especially against the clergy. And we must return to the old system was better. The penal law in the canon law, it must be re-established for overcoming this crisis.
Your Eminence, give me your sense. I've been talking for weeks now, really for months, about the need for a forensic audit, a financial forensic audit, similar to what Cardinal Pell had begun in the Vatican. And during his time, he dug up and exposed a lot of hidden accounts, money that was unaccounted for. In an audit, you see everything. And with that, I'm sure you've seen in your work, through those financial misdeeds, you can usually find others. Would you support, is that perhaps what we need to do now?
I think in the Vatican, it's not also all well organized. And we need a strict and very clear organization of the good of the church, but also a renewal of the thinking, of the mind, of the mentality, belonging to a mentality. We in some parts of the world we have another relation to the money. No? In Germany or now in the United States, it's very clear what is the money, your personal money, what is the money for the institutions, and what is the money of the diocese, of the parishes. It must become clearer, the system.
Transparency.
This transparency. No?
Let's talk for a moment about the corruption of doctrine, which you have spoken movingly about in many contexts. I remember during the Amoris Laetitia conversation, you certainly were not sold on the idea of granting communion to a second wife when a marriage did not have an annulment. The question of opening that up was of concern for you. We now have a youth synod that just began in Rome this week. In the documentation, some are saying this new document allows for terminology like LGBT and different lifestyles, and they claim the young people are demanding this. Indeed, Cardinal Baldessari, who's the secretary of the synod, said, we put that in there, that language, because the young people demanded it. Well, it turns out they didn't demand it, which he had to admit. What do you think is happening here with this youth synod? And are you comfortable with this idea of reoccurring synods that almost look like mini Vatican IIs?
The Synod of the Bishop is not an ecumenical council, has no authority. Even if the popes are speaking about the authority, it's not a magisterial authority. Also, the Pope cannot change the basic constitution of the Church. He cannot give a new definition what is a papacy, the primacy of the Bishop of Rome, or what has bishops to do. But behind of this synods are some movements to change the doctrine of the Church. And this is a developing of the doctrine, but if you say today A and tomorrow B, from A to B is not a development, can be the contradiction. And it is absolutely impossible if anybody is in the state of a mortal sin, he cannot receive the Holy Communion before he had confessed his sin, had get the absolution, and there is no possibility to change this basic fundament of the sacramentology.
But
and also according to the sixth commandment, to the sexual moral, there is no way to an acceptance of homosexuality as a practice. It is against the sixth commandment, and the only way of a legitimate realization of your sexuality is for us Christians, according to the laws of God Himself, is a legitimate marriage.
in this new apostolic constitution, and I have to challenge you a little bit on what you said a moment ago, in the Pope's new apostolic constitution on the Synod of Bishops that will govern them all, called Episcopal Communion, in it he says the final documents with the approval of Peter, the Pope, has magisterial authority. Do you believe that's true?
I don't know from where is coming out this idea. This seems to be a contradiction to the First Vatican Council and the Second Vatican Council. The ordinary magisterium is that what the Church is teaching all the day, and not of a synod, because the synod is an assembly of some bishops, but it's not ecumenical council, and it's not local synod, and has as such not this authority about which they are speaking. But if the Pope says this only these texts are a certain preparation, that is my teaching. But this teaching of the Pope must always be in concordance, in identity with the teaching of the Holy Scripture and the apostolic tradition, and of all what the magisterium before has said. It cannot be in contradiction.
You must be very concerned about these upcoming synods. When you hear the Youth Synod is focused on the question of LGBT young people and their rights, the upcoming synod on the Amazon is supposedly going to focus on celibacy and whether you can ordain married men. Is it a possibility that we may see a change in those teachings, those doctrines?
We have dogmatic doctrines, but the celibacy is not absolutely and it's not absolutely necessary for all priests. We have also married priests in the
Eastern Rite.
It's a rite, or also the priests in the ordinariate, the former Anglican priests. But the Vatican Council that is a deep accordance, deep identity between the life of the priest and the celibacy in favor of the kingdom of God. Is not only an external link, but is an inner spiritual link according to the long and deep tradition of the Latin Church. But these people, aside of the Pope, with his friends, they have this strange idea: we must make the doctrine of the Church is too hard, no? And we must be a bit more comfortable to the meaning of today. Always they are saying we must listen to the people of God, and the bishops has to listen to the people of God. That is a strange idea. The people of God, lay people and the bishops first have to listen to the word of God. We are not the masters of the Church, and also the Pope is not the boss of the Church. He cannot do what he wants. But Pope Benedict says the Pope is a figure in the Church most bound by the truth, the revealed truth and the revealed faith. And I think aside of the Pope, there are many people with a very low understanding of the Catholic theology, and a lot of journalists, nothing against journalists.
Easy there, easy there, Your Eminence.
But they have their work and their task and their job, but to be a counselor of the Pope, this must be a very profound theologians. No? We have the theologians, the committee of the international group of theologians. The Pope must listen to these experts in theology. The ecclesiology doesn't begin in our days. We have a long history in what church is or is not.
Right.
This is a sacrament, sign, and instrument for the intimate union of God with man, and not a worldly organization, not a party who can change the program according to the voters, and so far. And it's very important first to listen what God is saying to us, but not in an evangelical Pentecostal way as a new revelation of the Holy Spirit, but the revelation is fulfilled in Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit does us remember us what Jesus has said, and we cannot change the revelation. And the doctrine of the Church must be very faithful and close to the Word of God, to the revelation which is given in Jesus Christ, once and forever.
Your Eminence, I want to show something to you just before I let you go. This is a clip of the Pope at the opening Mass of this Synod. He is particularly moved by the presence of two Chinese bishops in the congregation. Watch.
Oggi, per la prima volta, sono qui con noi anche due confratelli vescovi della Cina continentale. Diamo loro il nostro caloroso benvenuto.
Your Eminence, you're well aware of the new deal struck between the Vatican and Beijing to choose bishops. You saw the two of the bishops who were gathered there at that synod. Now, we should remind the audience, these are bishops that were chosen by the Chinese government that the Pope recently, last week, brought into the fold and said, now you're official. Your thoughts on this China-Vatican deal?
Yeah, I trust more in the Cardinal Sen, because he has all the experience with the communists and with their lies and the persecution they had made. Surely the Pope has the office and the task to recall these schismatics to the full communion of the Church. But the question is, what is the price for it? A deal, can we make a deal, the Holy Church, the body of Christ, with the communists, with the atheists? And I think the only way, I am not an expert in these questions, and in the diplomacy, the way is not always absolutely clear. But for me, as a theologian, the first word is the truth of the revelation and the autonomy of the Church in their doctrine and their religious life. Or is this deal based on the religious liberty? Gives the Communist Party in China to Catholic Church or other dominations and religions the complete liberty based on the human rights. The human rights, religious freedom, cannot be a concession of a powerful, almighty party, political party, and this is absolutely against the natural law that a group of men or one man, a dictator or dictatorship of a party, has the absolute powers, also spiritual power about the conscience of the people. The authority of the modern democratic states are reduced only for the organization of the society, but they cannot understand themselves as having the absolute power about the thinking and the behavior. And I would ask, is here respected the freedom, religious freedom of the Catholic Church? And that can only be the basis of a reconciliation with these bishops, not authorized in their holy orders by the Pope, not in full communion with the Pope. And we must refuse all interference of political powers in our religious life.
Finally tonight, someone I'm personally very thankful for. She's the mother of Mattie Stepanek, the prolific poet, peace advocate, and philosopher who captured the hearts of media figures and the public alike. Oprah Winfrey, Larry King, President Jimmy Carter, and countless others were touched by the purity of his message and the Catholic faith that informed it. JENI STEPANEK has carried that message on despite her own hardships, and she herself is a courageous example of living and loving beyond disability and loss. We spoke with her about her work to further her son's message, his cause for canonization, and much more. Here's my exclusive interview with Dr. JENI STEPANEK. JENI, Mattie would have been 28 years old this July 17th. What do you want people to know about he and his message all these years later?
I would say that his message is as valid, as necessary, and as real today as it was when he was sharing it. Hope is real, and peace is possible, and life is worthy. And I think the more we learn in our world, the more we grow forward, the more things like social media connect us, the more important it becomes for us to understand the importance of peace and our personal choices in what we say, in what we do, and how we interact with people. And I think that's really where we are now, is bringing peace up to date and making it relevant to youth and adults today.
I am always amazed, just seeing you looking so great, so engaged, so vibrant. People wouldn't know that since we last saw you on the show, you've been diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer. You're battling neuromuscular disease. What of Mattie's message or words have inspired you to go on, to continue this celebration and battle?
When I was going through chemotherapy a couple of years ago, I actually would blog every week, and I would find something that Mattie wrote and create an entire blog based on that, because Mattie inspired me to believe that hope is real. Hope is not a magical cure, it's not a fix, it's not a miracle that's going to heal you, but hope anchored in faith, anchored in finding some reason to be grateful, or even a source of service for someone else, even in moments of suffering, that can get you into some next moment, can help you deal with even the worst pain. So Mattie inspired me to really root myself in hope, not in illusion, but in the hope that somebody beats the odds, in the hope that even with progressive diagnoses, that I have purpose, and that purpose can be to serve God and to serve others, and to be a source of hope and peace for our world, just as Mattie was.
One of the things I loved about Mattie's message, more importantly, Mattie's example, and yours, is that despite the challenges you were dealing with, or that he was dealing with, you're focused really on the other people and on others. And tell the story of the day that the Oklahoma City bombing happened. He's what, 4 years old?
He was 4 years old. It was in April of 1995. And he had been watching something on TV, and it went off, and the news came on, and it was about the Oklahoma bombing. I quickly turned it off and tried to explain to him what had happened. But in that brief amount of time, he had already seen these devastating images of children and adults who died, and who were going to be survivors and living with the pain. And I talked to him about praying for the survivors, praying for the victims. And he said that's important. We can pray for the families, we can pray for them, but we need to really pray for the people who did this, because they're the ones that don't have peace in their hearts. We need to pray for people to have peace so that this stops. And he was as concerned about whoever caused this violence as he was about the children and the adults and the survivors, in a different way. It was a different type of concern, a different type of prayer, but in his heart, Jesus died for sinners, and he wanted the sinners to have peace in their heart and to understand why this was wrong, why no matter what you're going through, this is not the right choice to deal with whatever your reality is or whatever your anger or issue is.
He also had a pretty dramatic response to 9/11.
Yes.
Tell us what happened.
Well, with 9/11, he watched personal friends literally go up in ash. He had been with firefighters on September 10th, and those very firefighters, some of them were in the World Trade Centers on September 11th and died. And on that day, Mattie wrote a series of poems and passages for peace, where he initially struggled, questioning, can we still find peace? Is there national security? Is there hope? Are we ever going to really get along with each other and stop this unnecessary violence? By the end of the day, he wrote a poem called For Our World that essentially says we need to stop, be silent, and notice, and to rebuild the mosaic of humanity, stop shattering it. I would say one of his biggest responses to interrupted peace was actually in 2003, when the United States bombed Iraq. And Mattie was in the hospital at the time, and we were watching some evening TV program, and they interrupted. And when he realized what he was seeing was missiles and bombs falling on Iraq, and he had been working so hard to create passages to inspire people to understand why war is an unnecessary evil, and that there are ways to resolve our conflicts without bombs. And when he saw these bombs fall, he literally had a physiological response. It changed his heart rate, his blood pressure, his skin turned blue. He was spiritually and emotionally devastated and physically compromised. And doctors and nurses were worried about him. I was quite worried. He really struggled with that, but came back even stronger and committed to sharing a message of peace. and sharing it in more and more ways so that people understand how peace begins. Not about pausing violence, but about how to begin peace. How to teach kindness and empathy to children, how to teach thoughtfulness and instill and nurture resilience in children and adults. So he began really breaking down the message into specific elements of hope and peace so that people could better understand.
You mentioned empathy, and he had it in amazing ways. I mean, even when he was struggling with imminent death, choking on his trachea, battling in and out of really, he crossed over to the other side and came back a few times. Tell me about that, the empathy you saw there in the hospital room.
In the hospital room, I had seen empathy in Mattie from the time he was literally 13 months old at a church picnic, where he showed empathy for a toddler who was crying, and he comforted her and helped her. And I saw that exact same empathy throughout his entire life, and the day he died. We knew he was dying. We didn't know it would be that day, but we knew he was gasping for breath, his bones were broken, and he was struggling literally for every single breath. And the baby in the next bed in the ICU was crying and crying. And Mattie started calling out, "Nurse, nurse, nurse," because he couldn't even really speak well anymore. And the nurse came running in and said, "What's wrong? Are you in pain?" And he said, the baby. And she said, "What's wrong? Is the crying bothering you?" And he said, "No." And he said, "Hold the baby. The baby is the future. The baby has purpose. Comfort the baby. Comfort the baby." And that nurse started crying. And she picked up the baby, and Mattie said, "Sing." And so she sang to the baby. And Mattie died within 24 hours of this happening. But he was so concerned about this baby knowing you matter. Even though you're in a hospital and you're suffering and you're in pain, but you matter, you have purpose, you are loved, you are cherished, and somebody's going to comfort you and hold you. And that was within the day of his death.
You have some concerns that people think of Mattie as a celebrity, and that Oprah is responsible for him in many ways.
I think when people hear Mattie's name, they think of him as Oprah's kid, and I think that's lovely. I think that's wonderful. And Mattie and Oprah were very close. They were sincerely friends and loved each other, and to this day she still loves him. And people think Mattie wanted to be on her show because he had poetry books. Really, his wish was that Mattie said when he was 6 years old, okay, and he wasn't on her show until he was 11.
Right.
When Mattie was 6 years old, he came to me and he said, "God put Oprah Winfrey and me on earth at the same time with purpose." I'm thinking, oh, did he now?
Really?
Of course, yeah.
Because he'd read a little biography of her.
He had read a little book about
bought.
her, and it was like an aha moment for him. Like, this is the person that's going to amplify my purpose. He said, God gave me a purpose of shaping a message of hope and peace so that people can understand what God wants them to understand. He said, I shape it for children, for adults, I shape it for Christians, for non-Christians. He said, I shape hope and peace into something that people understand how they can be a source of hope and peace, even in hopeless moments, even in moments of suffering, even when there's war and trauma. But he said, what I need is to get this message out to the world, because otherwise I've got this message, I've done what God's asked me to do. I have been a messenger, I've shaped it, but then it just sits in my computer.
And he saw Oprah as the vehicle of that heart song, that
so
message.
he saw that people turned to Oprah for inspiration. And when he saw that Oprah Winfrey was a person that knew what it was like to suffer, she was not born rich. She knew what it was like to suffer and rise up out of the ashes. So he believed that she would understand the message, and he wanted her to share the message that he had shaped. It was a bonus that she had him on the show, and it was an unusual situation that she realized he was real. He was not a poet kid. He was not a child whose mother wanted him to be on Oprah. He was really a messenger of hope and peace. And that's why they became friends. That's why he was on her show multiple times, not because he was a cute celebrity kid,
No.
but because he was an authentic bearer of a message of hope and peace.
Jerry Lewis also had him on as his MDA spokesman for a number of years. He was often on the telethon. I want to show people a little clip of that.
You let them know what life is about because of your presence and your courage.
Life is a gift, true. It's hard, and it's not always the easiest thing. But if it wasn't, you know what? The challenges in life are a part of our life, and that's how we learn. And some of us are meant to have a disease, and some of us, like you, are meant to help fight it. All of us have a reason, and we have to choose to always live our lives to the fullest. No one is better or worse than anyone else. We are different and beautiful.
And I think that is an important and powerful message. People look at children with disabilities and see them as less than perfect. They see children with developmental disabilities as children that need fixing, that need help. The help that all children need, with or without disabilities, medical, physical, spiritual, or cognitive, the help they need is to become their best self, to realize their purpose and their gifts from God and celebrate those gifts in a way that makes the world a better place, a fuller place. And so when you're born with a disability, yes, there's suffering involved, but it's not a mistake. It's not that God made an oops and this child is less than another child. And Mattie understood that. And he cherished all children, all people.
Now I see you struggling against infirmity and time to continue this message, to spread it. What is that heart song that you want people to hear? Both Mattie's and yours.
Well, I'll begin with mine. Mine is simply that you matter, and each moment matters. And we can't control whether a moment is going to be one with suffering or one worthy of celebration. All we can have a choice in is what we do with that moment and with the next moment, how we move through it. All we can do is choose to be kind, choose to reflect God's presence in any moment, choose to, of course we all hope for another moment. I have prayed to overcome the odds. I've prayed for more time. I've been told several times for different reasons in the last 3 years that my time is up. And yes, I'm human. I pray for more time. I am looking forward to being with my children again. I do hope that I see the face of God. But life is so worthy, even amid suffering, that if I can find a way to be a source of hope for someone else, and I learned this from Mattie. All right, Mattie's heart song was to be a source of hope and peace for other people so that it becomes real. If they don't believe it's real, be real for them. And that was why Oprah loved him. He was real. And I've learned that as well, is that if I can be helpful to you, hope for you, if I can bring you a moment of peace, then I'm reflecting God's presence on earth even amid challenges. And that makes life worthy for me and for you. You matter. Every moment matters.
A cause has been started for his sainthood, of which I am a part in full disclosure. Give me a sense, a part of that process is heroic virtue and virtue well lived. I know Mattie had a devotion to Andre Bessette. Tell me about, he received a relic
Yes.
from Andre Bessette.
Yes.
Which was very important to him
Yes.
at a particular time.
In 2001, Mattie almost died. He slipped into several comas. And in fact, the doctor said he would not survive more than a few days, possibly a few weeks if he was lucky. His body literally was dying around his spirit. One of the big problems was his trachea was eroding, just falling apart. And he was bleeding constantly. He was bleeding from his fingers, his lips, his trachea, his feet. And somebody brought him a relic from Andre Bessette. And at the time, Andre Bessette was beatified but not canonized. And Mattie prayed for several weeks with this relic sitting on his hospital tray. And then he asked to go home. And the doctors disagreed with him going home. They said, you're going to die, and if you go home, you're going to die in agony. If you stay here, we can at least comfort you and give you pain medicine for those final minutes. And he said, I have to live until the moment I die. And if I stay here, I'm dying until the moment I die. He said, I still have purpose. I still have a message. I cannot finish my mission, my ministry in the hospital. And he said, I think I've got more time. And he was just absolutely convinced.
How old was he at this point?
He was 10 when he began it. He went home just about a week or two after he turned 11. And on the day that they said he could go home, they were sending him home in an ambulance because they really didn't think he would survive the trip home. But it was his wish to be at home, and they were respecting his wish. He picked up the relic of Andre Bessette, and he said out loud, Brother Andre, you need a miracle to become a saint, and I need a miracle to fulfill my purpose from God. Let's work together. And he touched the relic to his trachea, and then he closed his eyes and said a silent prayer. He never talked to me about what he said. And after a minute, he put the relic down, and the bleeding stopped, stopped. And he said, okay, I'm ready to go home. And I looked, and I went and got the doctors, and I said, the bleeding stopped. And the doctors were concerned. They said, when the bleeding stops, what's likely going to happen is it's going to scab, and the first time he coughs, it's going to just perforate the entire trachea, and he's going to suffocate. And they said, do you still want to take him home? Because this is what we've been waiting for. And I talked to Mattie, and he said, no, I've gotten a miracle. And I said, what if you're wrong? What if this is scabbing? And he said, no, I know I've gotten a miracle. I'm ready to go home and fulfill my purpose.
And this is before Oprah,
before all that,
the
yes.
poetry, before all of that.
Yes. But he had already written most of the poetry.
Right.
The whole Oprah, I'd like to go back to that if that's okay.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because a lot of people know him from, and they think, well, he was Oprah's most frequent guest, and that's what they know him from.
Right, but there's a whole different story. But what happened was, he did get a miracle. He lived another 3 years before that bleeding started back up, and he died. And in that 3 years is when everybody learned about him. But we were shocked when he went home, and literally the bleeding stopped, and the doctors could not explain it. And then he believes that he got another miracle. A few months later, he had another open sore that needed surgery, and actually, speaking of Oprah had asked him what he wanted for Christmas, and he said prayer. And so she got worldwide prayer for him.
I remember
and
that.
The sore on the back of his head that had been there for almost a year, that was getting to a life-threatening point, just closed up. They could not explain it. On the 30th day of prayer, she had 30 days of prayer. On day 30, the sore closed up and never opened again. But yes, he received a miracle, and he kept that relic on his wheelchair until the day he died. I now have the relic next to my bed in his honor.
For information on Mattie Stepanek and Jenny's ongoing campaign for peace, visit mattieonline.com. Before we go, I want to thank all of you for your dedication to the program, for being here with us each and every week. We do this show for you, and you are always in our hearts and minds. And I also have to thank my producers, Christopher Edwards, James Faulkner, Christina Kelly, for all their hard work, and Jonathan Watley, our editor, and the crew you don't see. I'm also grateful to all the men and women of the military who protect our freedoms, and for my family and friends who sustain me in all I do. We all have so much to be thankful for. I hope you take time to do so this Thanksgiving. That is all the time we have for now. Until next week. The show continues on Facebook and Twitter. Like me on Facebook. You can follow me on Twitter. The links are at raymondarroyo.com. Book 3 in the Will Wilder series is coming in February. In the meantime, the first 2 books are on bookshelves everywhere. Get those books. They're great Christmas gifts. They're available at the EWTN Religious Catalog and at bookstores, wherever you can find them. Be sure to join us next week. Until then, happy Thanksgiving. We'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thank you for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo from Washington, D.C. Bye now.